Can take their seats. We would love to get started so we can try to keep things on time. And I'm so thrilled to see so many of you all back for this afternoon. That was a really inspiring luncheon speech. And I'm really wearing two hats here today. Although some of you know that I was a former member of the FCC in the United States, I'm really here both as the special envoy for child online protection from the ITU, as well as I'm very thrilled to have joined EWI as a senior fellow, so I'm also glad to be here with that hat on as well. I think that what we have heard over the past few days has really been the same vocabulary over and over and over, and that is trust, trustworthiness, trusted sources, trusted communications. And so we are going to delve into that a little bit more. One of the first things that I wanted to do was maybe connect the dots for you all a little bit. So why are we talking about youth and children at EWI and at a cybersecurity summit? So I wanted to give you a couple of quotes that I think are really may help us as we move forward this afternoon. So under the undersea cable best practices, where you all today, it was announced, have been moving from thinking to doing and action, this quote I thought really stood out. The sharing of information will only occur and flourish in an environment characterized by openness, concern for the common good, and most of all, trust. So I can't imagine any other subject than our children and youth that could apply to more. However, it also happens to apply to undersea cable. As related to some of your recommendations regarding the distinctive emblem principle in cyberspace, here's another quote. Ultimately, the value of maintaining the ability to distinguish between protected zones can be immeasurable as the value of human life is immeasurable. So what could be more immeasurable, of course, as you will hear more about this today, than our children and our youth, our nation's individual greatest natural resources? Or, as we've been discussing the Chinese-U.S. issue of fighting spam to again build trust, isn't protecting our children just another issue upon which our countries can indeed build trust? So, as you all will hear, there are many people that are doing statistical research about what is going on with our children online at younger and younger ages. Just since my last speech, if you were merely looking at population numbers, can anyone shout out the third largest country in the world? It is Facebook. So between my last speech and this speech, it's moved from the fifth largest to the third largest. Over 40%, in fact, in the United States, over 50% of our children have been cyberbullied online. Only 10% of kids even report that. 21% of our kids have been involved in fatalities through using devices, and in the United States, of course, we're facing huge issues regarding health care, which you heard about a little bit earlier this morning, about whether or not we might actually use some of the templates from the health sector. Obesity, mental health issues, some people have actually called it Google depression, suicides, bullycides, addiction to videos, violent videos, private data, which you will hear much about later today from the panel members. And of course, location devices, the GPS tracking of our devices, which means the tracking of us, our personal information, and then of course the tracking of any young child that has such a device. As many of you all know, there have been hearings going on here, of course, in the UK and of course in the United States Congress on privacy specifically. The FTC, for the first time ever, issued a report in December that said that self-regulation had not gone far enough. And a very conservative group, the Academy of Pediatrics, also issued a report for the first time ever saying that pediatricians in America should be involved in this issue and should be asking our children how much time and what are they doing online. If you haven't read the Wall Street Journal's series of articles called What You Know, I would highly commend that to you. And some of the issues that are in that article or that series of articles, and you will hear more about, are whether or not compliance by providers should be voluntary, and if it is voluntary and certain providers then are not participating, what do we do about that? What are the standards in technology regarding keeping our children safe? How do we ensure knowledge and education of our children and all consumers, actually? I think you all will hear some interesting statistics and information that maybe you don't even know about your online privacy and your online information. Where do consumers and children go for any kind of relief? And how transparent are providers in providing us all of this information? There will be a discussion about a possibility of a code of conduct. When the Secretary mentioned a blank piece of paper, that's sort of what we did earlier this week, and as we have been having breakout sessions along with you all. Should we propose things like no third-party advertising or bot or cookie access whatsoever? Should we have explicit opt-in in order for companies to sell or use or transfer our data in any way? And should we require the application of ethical behavior as we would in the real world to the online world? And then something that was just discussed at lunch, and that is, should we require any kind of robust authentication? There will be a little discussion of a digital Bill of Rights. I hope we can talk about that and how we can prepare our digital citizens for today and for the challenges of tomorrow. There are many opportunities going on, not just in the ICT sector. Coke has youth campaigns that are in over 37 countries. I'm hoping that this is something that perhaps through EWI and other of those of you all who are in the private sector who may want to get involved in some of those, you'll also hear more from my colleagues here on the panel about what is going on. An example of something, a template that we might use, Microsoft has developed a lot of digital facial identification. Originally it was used regarding child pornography. It would be interesting if we could actually use that to authenticate children online. Daily we read about data breaches. I'm sure many of you all picked up the newspaper and saw today's latest, and if you haven't read this, I strongly suggest if you all Skype that you look at how your information can be collected by utilizing Skype. So I think that just as the mission with EWI is to mobilize and discuss new issues, to try to bring together multi-stakeholders and leading both business and government to address cybersecurity in these challenging days. So I hope that you all will be ready to perhaps ask some questions of the panel. The first person who will be speaking is Dr. James Lyne. He's been with us before in Columbia, where we had an all-day youth summit at Columbia University, both in New York a couple of months ago and then again on the 31st right here in London. And he's the Director of Technology Strategy for Sophos. And James, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Actually, the Columbia experience was significant for me in that it was the first time that I've ever presented and been upstaged by a group of Girl Scouts on the topic of cybersecurity. Certainly an experience that many of us probably haven't shared. I wanted to give a brief update on a workshop that we ran this Tuesday on the topic of protecting yourself and your digital identity online. And I had the pleasure of participating in this workshop with a mix of different generations. I had a set of people that had been in academia for many, many years. I also had young teachers going through the training program, as well as people at school and everyday adults that frankly admitted they had little knowledge of cybersecurity. It's a fascinating blend of different perspectives. And really, I think we all agreed that there were massive threats and opportunities as we increasingly integrate digital and physical life together. We talked about the massive escalation in the volume of threats from cyber criminals, the changes in the way that we're using technology. Many of you will have heard me say before that we see now 95,000 individual pieces of malicious code every single day. And the core of the issue that we came to is really that we see an increasing gap between the technology and the capabilities available to protect people online and those that actually get deployed. We see a trajectory for failure. And the core of that, we believe, is really one of awareness. It's one of responsibility. Awareness for young people in schools, understanding how to protect themselves online, and responsibility for large providers. You commented on Facebook being the third largest country in the world. Well, I've got news for you. Countries tend to have healthcare schemes and government and policy bodies to make sure that things are run the right way for their citizens. Perhaps we need to consider similar measures for such significant providers online. So we talked through all of these issues, but ultimately we came to the conclusion that this big topic would most likely be moved most forward through a big change in delivery of our message. We agreed that cybersecurity is often preached in terms that is uncomfortable for young people. We talked about how the notion of cybersecurity and cyber safety would immediately make someone switch off and, particularly in my case, want to do exactly what was being preached I shouldn't. We talked about the importance of changing the message towards cyber literacy, making it a more engaging cross-curricular process, and teaching these skills early on in schools. We talked about how we need to value cybersecurity and cyber skills as much as English or maths, rather than compressing them to the small hours of the curriculum, accepting that the ability to protect yourself online and be a digital citizen is as important as any other subject in tomorrow's brave new world. We talked about how cybersecurity and cyber privacy needed to be delivered using a variety of alternate means. Things like the Cybersecurity Challenge, online games that invited people to participate through the cyber community rather than the conventional classroom. We talked about how people were much more likely to listen to their peers on the topic of protecting yourself online versus the conventional classroom, and how we should all be encouraging peer mentoring training programs and the like. So specific suggestions that came from our workshop, which I think are excellent. Firstly, we encourage that we develop a specific place for cybersecurity and cyber skills in the curriculum, a place that is valued as much as English, maths, or science. We want schools to consider mentoring programs and to speak a language that students will relate to and understand. We want to push the message that online and offline life are now the same. There was a suggestion that perhaps all of this cybersecurity business was a temporal issue, and that when the new generation came along, all of us old people could get out of the way and they'd fix it for us. Controversial, I thought. But actually, we all agreed that the younger generation, whilst they were much more technology savvy, we all actually have different privacy issues. In some regards, we're sharing more information online and being more carefree with privacy than the previous one. So specific initiatives we want to run. We want to make this topic exciting and relevant. Get away from the boring terms like information assurance and cyber safety, and integrate this into everyday life. We're proposing that we could run a project with public and private sector organisations together to get into schools with passionate role models to talk about cybersecurity, cyber safety, and why as well this is an interesting profession. We're proposing that we develop packages of content, much like the A to Zs we've been distributing here, that speak the right language, that are simple and are accessible. And we also want to see a young train-the-trainer program for teachers, making sure that all of these people being tasked with developing the next generation cyber skills are given the latest and greatest advice. As many of our young teachers commented, they walked into that teacher training knowing more than the person that was supposedly going to train them. So all in all, the overarching message is recognition that this is not going to be an issue that just disappears with the next generation. The issues will be different. Technology will continue to change, and cyber criminals will continue to attack us. But our biggest issue in this area is how we convey our message, the language that we use, and is one of awareness more so than any specific technical issue, which I must admit is an unusual thing for a technologist that spends all his time building strange things with a soldering iron to say. Thank you.
Thank you, James. David is from the Family Online Safety Institute. He lives here, but FOSI is global, and so he spends a lot of his time in many other nations. And please talk to us a little bit about what you all are doing.
Great. Thanks, Debbie. The Family Online Safety Institute, as Debbie said, is an international organization, and we're supported by around 30 of the largest industry players in our work, and we're really appreciative of that. And our aim is really to make a big difference in terms of making the internet safer and better around the globe. And that's a pretty big task. And we have many of the main players in this market, from Microsoft and Facebook and Google, and we're actively involved with them. And along with the rest of the multi-stakeholder community, we convene conferences. We have a major First Ladies initiative in Mexico and the Dominican Republic. And we really try and bridge the digital divide between not just the developed and developing world, but between the generational divide between parents and their children. And that's a huge task, and that's not something we can do on our own. One of the things I think we've learned in terms of approaching the term digital citizenship, which is something we've been advocating for some while, is that it's really about equipping children with the rules, schools, and the resilience, really, to navigate themselves through this world. Where parents are time poor, and the reality is that children are really the computer administrators in most families, they are often unsupervised, and so giving them that resilience is really very important, and educational systems around the world will need to change to reflect that to some degree. And we believe that digital citizenship is as much about getting all the elements of that together, whether that's teachers, law enforcement, government, industry, all of those elements together to come up with solutions, country by country, in relationship to the cultural context in which those things play out. And what we're trying to do is really build a narrative of trust. And I think what I've seen here in the youth conference that we had on Tuesday is that actually a big component of that narrative of trust is the contribution of youth to that narrative in terms of defining that. A challenge for industry, and I would say for a lot of people, is a very simple question. What is the state of family online safety right now? Is the internet actually getting safer, or is it getting more risky for families? What are the risks, and are they the same around the world? And that's quite a challenge. So to answer some of those questions, we built something called the Global Resource and Information Directory, or GRID. If you go to fosigrid.org, it'll be the top search within Bing or Google, you will see that free portal. And that's been funded by Microsoft, Verizon, and a lot of other industry players. And that talks to this question of what's going on around the world. And it tracks all 192 countries, both in terms of legislation, research, law enforcement, and the active NGOs in this space. And it's an incredible picture. And it tells us a number of things. It tells us that most countries really act as national online markets. It also tells us that economic and competitive advantage are the priorities, and in some countries, the safety and rights of citizens are secondary. And so it's a very, very challenging environment. There is another element, too, is that we would contend that actually we're starting to reach a bit of a technology plateau in terms of what consumers are seeing. All the key components we consider are there. Search, low-cost infrastructure, video, mobility, all the things that are going to give us the characteristics for the next few years are largely in place. And whilst there's still significant change happening, what we're saying is now's the time to start to do some forward planning in terms of what we want to do in terms of family online safety. And the start point for that is research. Any good business will tell you that competitive advantage has to start with finding out what your competitors are doing. And in the real world, it's the same. And actually, in terms of pattern and gap analysis for GRID, the astounding thing is how little research has been done, and what research has been done usually gets outdated very quickly. So we would argue that as we start to reach this more even level in terms of technology, we should be investing heavily in research. And GRID is part of that evidence base on which companies and governments can start to make decisions, policy decisions, and not make assumptions. There are one or two other elements I just want to touch on. Developed versus developing countries is a very interesting space. If you look at the demographic shift that's going on at the moment and look at Arab countries, 40 to 50% of their population are under the age of 25. And the irony is probably the children and families that are most at risk are in the developing world, where the majority of growth is going to come from. So whilst we need to be preoccupied with the risks and the opportunities for children in the developed world, in the developing world, they're going to be far greater, where socioeconomic situations are different and priorities. So we have to be very balanced, and I would argue that we need to think a lot more about the global perspective of this, and whilst we do act locally, we should think globally. And last, I think the final point that I would make is that we do see a lot of initiatives now around the digital agenda in the UK, identity ecosystems, and I do believe that some technology will fix some of these issues going forward in the exciting ways that we see here. But I think there's one other element that GRID shows us, and I think it's very important. Whether a child is in California, Czech Republic, or China, the way that they use technology and the issues that they face around privacy and cyberbullying and sexting are actually very similar. And that's an exciting opportunity, because if you extrapolate that forward, what it means, and it would be far worse if actually technology was being deployed in all fundamentally different ways in all different places. It does mean that if we can come up with some overarching global perspectives in education, in policy, in technology design, its application universally should be much easier. And I think that's a very significant opportunity given the commonality that exists in the way that people use the internet. So that's one of the roles that FOSI plays, to give that global perspective. We're grateful for industries supporting that, but we're also grateful for the wider multi-stakeholder community and engagement with people like the ITU COP and EWI and people in this room, because on our own we can't do it, but together we can make a huge difference.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
So I always bring things to show. This is information from the AE. This is the ITU's Child Online Protection. This is Common Sense Media curriculum, and this one is actually from Iran. So as you all can see, there is quite a bit of work being done regarding curriculum and also trying to bring it to the local level. So it's global to local, and it's also local to global as it all fits together. Now we'd like to hear from someone quite a bit younger than most of us in this room. Rachel Silver is the head of movements.org, and she's been with us for several days. And Rachel, please tell us about your thoughts about the last few days.
Thank you. Hi. I'd just like to say thanks again for having me. It's really been amazing to take part in this program and to be able to represent the voice of international youth in a summit like this. At Movements.org, we work with young digital activists. These are people all over the world using online and mobile technologies for nonviolent social change. While many dangers and worst-case scenarios have been presented and discussed over the last 2 days, I'm lucky enough to spend my time focusing on exciting examples where young people are using the internet to change the world we live in for the better. Activists in our network are using tools like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to fight for social good, peace, and opportunities in the countries where they live. I mention this to remind everyone that while there's many risks and challenges to youth's experience online, the internet's also an incredible tool for connecting and empowering people. The EastWest Institute's Digital Safety and Citizenship program has been hosting international working groups so that we can compare and contrast the issues affecting youth all over the world and truly integrate the notion of international digital citizenship. Building on the ideas that we outlined at the International Youth and Technology Forum held in April at Columbia that was just mentioned, these working groups help to complete our diverse task force. Members of the Movements.org network, some of which are here today, Ali Awad, Eric Acha, and Kingsley and Irene Bangwell, hosted working groups in Lebanon, Cameroon, and Nigeria, respectively. They brought together over 1,000 young people in their communities, ranging from ages 10 to 26 years of age. Their discussions focus on concerns they have with their online experience and measuring the levels of digital literacy and risks online in those places. They each did an amazing job of convening bright young people, synthesizing their opinions, and presenting them to the audience at the first International Youth Conference on Digital Citizenship 2 days ago at the British Museum. The concerns they voiced on behalf of the youth in their communities included scamming, phishing, online pornography, slow connection speeds, cyberbullying, privacy, and the high cost of connecting to the internet in certain parts of the world. These opinions helped to inform the discussion and served as a comparison to the concerns voiced by youth from East and West alike. Regarding the recent EG8 meeting in Paris, Lawrence Lessig mentioned that the future of the internet was not present at that meeting. Building on the recommendations of last year's summit in Dallas, many more young people were included in this year's event in London. That said, I think it's vital that we continue to include more young people in these conversations in high-level meetings, specifically young people from communities who are just getting online or who are yet to be online. If we're to protect and ensure the future prosperity of the digital economy, then we have to include the future engineers, the future CTOs, and the next Mark Zuckerbergs in these type of gatherings. If you take a minute and look around the room today, it's clear that while the efforts have begun, we still have a long way to go. All of you have an interest in building a culture of digital citizenship and in drafting and implementing codes of conduct, whether technical, like requiring privacy-preferred settings like opt-ins rather than opt-outs, or committing to industry-wide ethical policies to protect the very people that will be chairing panels like this. Government, business, and civil society advocacy groups have a role to play in creating a safer space for young people to interact online. By enabling youth to interact with and better understand the policies that we make, but also the code that we write, we're educating them to be good digital citizens today and in the future. So my recommendation today is to remember to invest in the future, in young people. If we don't help them to interact safely online, then where will we be? Organizations like ITU, EWI, FOSI, and GSMA are doing really important work. It's been highlighted today on this panel. They're crafting guidelines for youth influenced by youth, which is really important. And everyone here should consider as they develop their products and services these types of guidelines. As I mentioned at the beginning, and I want to end with this, I spend my time identifying young innovators using technology to make the world a better place. I've met people like Shubham Kanodia, a high school boy in India who created a Facebook group following the Mumbai bombings in 2008 to help victims and families connect, find survivors, and organize blood drives. Just days after launching this group, he had over 100,000 members. I've interviewed members of the Pakistan Youth Alliance who are using Facebook to raise money to help flood victims in Pakistan. They've helped over 25,000 families in need. These innovative young people use Facebook as a platform to fundraise for their humanitarian activities, and then they post photos of the projects on Facebook to establish trust and transparency with their donors. It's really impressive work being done by really young people in places where concerns online are very different from where many of us are from. I'm highly optimistic about the future of the internet and the possibilities for young people to use it for good. However, we have to support and protect them in the process. I'd just like to call on everyone here today to do so not just by intention but by action. I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing from a larger youth delegation in Delhi and to seeing the fruit produced by your commitment to working with younger generations to truly change the face of the world, both offline and in the virtual state. Thank you.
I hope that wasn't lost on you all, that this is true action. Rachel, in just the last few months since we first launched this concept of involving youth voices, over 1,000 children across Africa and
Lebanon, Cameroon, and Nigeria.
It's just frankly unbelievable. And so we see the power of the internet every day, but we just have to make sure, obviously, that it is both safe and secure and trusted. So now we'll hear from an even younger voice, Conrad Rauscher, who I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the past few weeks, attends PA Cyber, a virtual high school. I'll let him tell you more about that, and we're really thrilled that he joined us and really gave voice to the young people that we all care about.
Thanks, Mrs. Tate. Before I start, I was just thinking that the fire alarm earlier might have been the result of some malicious hackers who don't want to lose their jobs. So, all right. Yesterday, the breakout groups on protecting youth were very exciting and thought-provoking for me, and I'm just going to relay some of the stuff that I got from it. To youth, the digital and real world isn't separate. It's one thing. Things youth do digitally can have very serious and dangerous effects on them in real life. It's really tragic that so many kids' futures are being ruined because of things that they do as kids in the digital world. parents are widely aware of dangerous content, but most don't know of the detailed collection of their data, of the children's data that is going on. Also, Tamira, a girl with Girl Guides here in the UK, was conveying that youth need to apply their street smarts to how they are using the digital world. They're taught them from a very young age. It's just common sense. You wouldn't walk up to a stranger and give them your name, where you're from, your address, phone number, 300 pictures of everything that you've been doing, and even relationship status. It's crazy. So why would you do that on the internet if you don't do it in real life? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to hear from you. So I think that what we have heard both from this panel and from actually one of the very first speakers, Secretary General Hamadoun Touré, and many other leaders, Ambassador Liu, also recognized that we can't have a discussion about cybersecurity and about trustworthiness of our cyberspace without including both youth voices and including the risks that they face online. I'm so glad that so many other people are beginning to recognize that. I have to say, I think the Secretary General was one of the very first global leaders who really recognized the connection between our children and the issues surrounding cybersecurity. I want to thank John Kluge so much for all that he's done to try to organize the Youth Summit and all the work that he's done over the last few months, and especially to thank all of EWI and the board for recognizing again the importance not just of talking about the subject and not just having adults and or experts to talk about the subject, but how important it is for us to both include and listen and hear and follow what we hear from the young people. In Dallas, I think it was probably the first time that EWI had broached this subject. And I think it's been a very fast-paced move to action. As you heard, we had a Technology and Youth Summit at NYU, and then just the other day, the London All-Day Youth Summit here. So we are already deeply, and I want to say EWI is deeply committed to action in this arena. So whether it's digital citizenship and curriculum moving forward, and by that I don't just mean digital citizenship for youth, but I mean really for all of us. We all need to be aware about what is going on with our information online, whether it's a Bill of Rights or whether it's more about standards and technology, and that we actually require and or ask for voluntarily that providers bake in privacy and bake in ways of protecting our children. And then whether we are going to move, as some countries have, to an opt-in type regime rather than opt-out. And so today perhaps is the call to action, which I think Rachel just said, and so we'll call on all of you in your respective positions as stakeholders and leaders and global thought and policy makers to help us move this forward. After hearing from this, I don't know, do we have a few minutes for questions? Yes. I think we do have a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Hi, Quentin Taylor. I've got one point to ponder, which is in the past, your youthful mistakes were local and transient, and now they are global and permanent. How would the panel think that there could be some way of making mistakes that someone did before they reached a certain age not a permanent stain on their career or character?
I'll just say a couple of things. One of the other technology solutions that is being discussed is whether or not there would truly be a delete button. Right now, most everything is viral and forever. How would that delete button work? How quickly would you have to decide to delete that? We're beginning to see in the States, and I'm sure all over the world, that much of the information that kids are posting are now preventing them from getting into colleges. They may actually, as with someone mentioned sexting and for those of you all who don't know or not aware, that's the sending of nude and semi-nude pictures over mobile networks in the United States that can be prosecuted in over 30 states. And then the child is actually required to register wherever they move as a sex offender. Potentially for the rest of their lives, depending on what the sentence is. I'll let my panel members speak.
Yeah, I've got a brief comment. So I get asked probably once a week, right after do you write all the viruses, can you delete things from the internet? And the answer really, if you're trying to boil it down to a specific case, is no. I think we learned from WikiLeaks that if something is distributed massively, if people start sharing, you've lost control. Once it's there, it's gone forever. I think that we can invest in developing more robust privacy frameworks that make it easier for content to be taken offline. I've had a very strange weekend hobby for a number of weeks where I would sign up to service providers, upload content, and go through the contrived legal process of writing letters with an actual pen. I had to learn to write to do it. It was astonishing. When you use a keyboard so much, you forget how difficult this is to have the content taken offline. And it's remarkably difficult. So I think we could invest in doing more of that, trying to provide some protection to allow mistakes to be made. But ultimately, once it's up there, it's there. That's the assumption we should all work to. It's unfortunate, but it is reality.
I think that the takeaway from this is that back to education and teaching kids, I think sometimes we don't give young people enough credit. I think that they're able to understand consequences when it's explained to them. And I think that if curriculums are put in place in school to teach children the consequences of what can happen when you upload certain things or share certain things, I think they'll understand and can have a sense of what's appropriate and what's not. As he pointed out, and it was brought up in the working group yesterday, young people certainly have a sense of common sense in their everyday lives and in the real world, and we just need to translate some of that common sense onto Facebook and onto YouTube and Flickr and things like that.
It's people my age you've got to worry about. We've got no common sense at all.
No hope for you,
No.
David? Maybe school children.
I think I would sort of not directly answer that question, but I think one of the problems is that adults are really not in a good place in terms of advising children, particularly children, the new generation whose notions of privacy and of self are going to be fundamentally different from us. So it's a real problem. I saw a statistic the other day that said that even in Europe, 30% of European citizens have never used the internet before. And that I find staggering. And actually the level of computer literacy in older age groups is amazing. So it makes them very poorly equipped to actually advise children. Many people in this room will have been brought up to cross the road or learn how to swim. But as parents, we were never taught to use the internet from day one. And so we're not, it's a bit like sex education. It's almost something we don't discuss. It's something that is really just beyond our experience. And the other thing too, and I certainly feel this, is I grew up in an environment when computing was a productivity thing. It was a productivity tool, as indeed phones were and things like that. Whereas I think today's youth see it just as a stream of consciousness, both on and offline. And that's very difficult for us to contend with. And I think lying in there are all those issues around privacy and so on, which society's going to have to work through at some point because it's not going to go away. And that's a really big challenge. So I think it's a great question.
What we were learning about in the Youth Congress before 2 days ago is Google before you tweet, think before you speak. You don't have to worry about it at all if you don't put it up in the first place. So youth really have to keep that in mind.
Very quick comment, just to add what was said here. You made me think of something that came up in the panel workshop that we ran the other day, which I thought was really interesting. It was tendered that lots of the older generation shy away from talking about cybersecurity issues and online security and privacy because of a fear of lack of knowledge. And one of the excellent points that was made is there's a big difference between knowledge and information and wisdom. And actually, the job in many cases of teachers and the older generation was to impart wisdom in perhaps how you would conduct your life online, as opposed to trying to understand and preach every specific, because frankly, we don't have a hope with a generation that's born and grown up with this technology. So I think that is an interesting distinction. But anyway, hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. I'm not sure if that's working. But what does the panel think about the implications of the Y generation perhaps putting less and less personal data online as lessons are learned for the valuations and business case of social media firms like Facebook, where identity capital is their primary asset?
I should ask which generation are you first, I guess. But, well, I'm not sure I really understand the valuation of those companies in the first place, to be honest, or the value of that IP. But there are a hell of a lot of people that are doing it, and we're in an increasing minority, those of us that don't.
Yeah,
No, I think we're going to continue sharing openly. I think we're radically changing the way that we communicate, and I think that that is not just something that's happening in social media in our private lives, but within the workplace. Look at 3 years ago in the average business, we were all trying to block social media. Now look at the number of companies that have someone with the job title Director of Social Media. I think this is not a revolution of how we text, but this is a fundamental change in how we communicate as human beings. And I expect that that will continue. Whether it will be Twitter limited to 140 characters, because let's be honest, that's rather irritating, or Facebook, I don't know. But certainly this doctrine of communication I expect to continue. I hope.
Yeah, I don't think people are going to start sharing less. I think it's just going to continue to snowball as it already has. But I do think when people understand the tools and technology they are smarter about them. If you are a developer or you know how to write code, you use tools differently because you understand how they work. And that's more technical, but the same applies to YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or anywhere else that you're sharing. When you understand the privacy policies or you understand that it can't ever be removed, you're inclined to share differently and to set your settings differently. And it is complicated only because it's often hidden, but when you actually get to the right place and read a lot of these policies, they're not that complicated. So if we, as people in this room who are writing those policies perhaps, or designing where they fit into our product, or advocating for children, can find a way to teach all consumers how to understand that and how to find it, people will just share smarter. They won't share less.
I think the key point is that the concept of identity capital is based on having specific items of information about people, allowing them to create a custom segment of one.
Yeah.
And if people conceal their identity, don't put their address online, don't put a phone number, even put a false name, then that identity capital is devalued dramatically. That's really one of the things.
yeah.
That is valid.
We have one other question, I think, in the back, and then we need to...
This question is primarily geared towards James, but really for anyone who wants to respond. I heard a few interrelated themes, the distinction between wisdom and knowledge in this space, street smarts being sort of something that you absorb organically over time and can then learn to apply to different contexts, the fact that there really is no true distinction between the online world and the offline world. With all of that said, what's the argument for having a discrete digital literacy curriculum as a separate subject from English and math and so on, when really we're saying this is part of the fabric of one's life rather than a discrete subject?
Excellent question, and perhaps I misrepresented the point that the workshop was trying to make. We feel that the topic of cyber literacy, the investment in the level of knowledge in teaching and training, needs to be equally as important as English, maths, and science. The internet... No. Okay, whoever you are, if you're in China, it's not funny. That was a test, okay.
Yeah, good.
So, as I was saying, obviously they didn't like that particular line. So I think it needs to be equally as important. The internet is the cornerstone of all of our businesses' growth over the coming years. It's the cornerstone of growth of us as a national economy. But equally, I think teaching this as a separate subject is a mistake. I think we all agreed, those of us in older academic tradition, new teachers, and those of us that had recently been through school, that this needed to be woven into the curriculum. This needed to be something that you learnt about in every classroom. It needed to be a part of every lesson and every piece of research. And it needed to be an integrated cross-curricular style of teaching as opposed to a separate one. But it must be equally valued and equally prioritized rather than some small obligation to be met on the side. Hopefully that clarifies the point.
Thank you all so much. I hope you will join me in thanking our panel. I hope you learned something from our panel, and I hope that you will join us. I hope you heard the call to action, that whatever your sphere is, join us because our children are our future. Thank you.